The year is 1861. The shadow of civil war stretches across the fractured nation, but in the secluded corners of the American countryside, life persists in a strange, often unsettling normalcy. In a remote part of the United States, nestled amongst dense woods that whispered secrets to the wind, stood the Bell Mansion. A grand yet somber edifice, it exuded an air of isolation, as if deliberately distancing itself from the burgeoning turmoil of the outside world. Within its walls resided Lilly Bell, a young woman of 19, and her father, the Reverend Thaddeus Bell. Lily's existence was a carefully curated tableau, each day mirroring the last with a disquieting precision. Her world revolved entirely around her father, a man of stern countenance and unwavering authority within their small, self-contained universe. Reverend Bell was a figure of respect in the sparse local community, known for his fervent sermons and an almost patriarchal control over his household. Yet, within the confines of their home, his demeanor shifted, revealing a possessiveness towards Lily that transcended the typical bounds of fatherly affection. He treated her not only as his daughter, but also with an expectation of devotion and intimacy that made the very air in the mansion feel heavy with unspoken tension. Lily, with her pale complexion and eyes that often held a distant, almost melancholic gaze, navigated this peculiar reality with a quiet compliance. Her days were filled with duties prescribed by her father, tending to the sprawling yet neglected gardens, reading scripture aloud in the dimly lit study, and sharing meals in a strained silence that hung thick between them. Her attire, always modest and dark, seemed to further emphasize her isolation. Any attempt to inquire about the world beyond their property was met with gentle but firm redirection, reinforcing the invisible walls that confined her. The only other presence in the Bell household was Mrs. Gable, an elderly woman who had served the family for years. Her movements were slow and deliberate, her face etched with a history Lily could only guess at. Mrs. Gable rarely spoke, but her eyes, when they occasionally met Lily's, held a depth of knowing that both intrigued and unsettled the young woman. There was a sense that Mrs. Gable understood the intricate, unspoken dynamics of the Bell family, the secrets that seemed to cling to the very fabric of the house. The established order of their isolated lives began to fray with the unexpected arrival of Dr. Elias Vance, a young physician recently settled in the neighboring town. Dr. Vance was summoned to the Bell Mansion when Reverend Thaddeus fell ill. His ailment was peculiar, marked by bouts of debilitating weakness and an unsettling pallor. For Lily, the doctor's arrival was a rare intrusion from the outside world, a fleeting glimpse of a life she had only imagined in the pages of her books. Dr. Vance, with his earnest demeanor and intelligent eyes, found himself increasingly intrigued by the atmosphere of the Bell household. The reverence with which Lily spoke to her father, coupled with the almost fearful glances she would occasionally cast in his direction, struck him as unusual. Reverend Bell, even in his weakened state, maintained a tight grip on his household, his interactions with Lily possessing a subtle undertone that made the young doctor uneasy. As Dr. Vance continued his visits, ostensibly to attend to Reverend Bell's failing health, he began to observe the subtle nuances of Lily's confinement. The lack of visitors, the remote location, and the almost palpable tension within the house painted a picture of isolation that went beyond mere reclusiveness. He sensed a story hidden beneath the surface, a narrative of unspoken rules and perhaps even suffering. The initial medical calls transformed into something more akin to an investigation, driven by a growing sense that all was not as it seemed within the imposing walls of the Bell Mansion. The mystery surrounding the absence of Lily's mother loomed large, an unspoken question that hung in the air like a persistent fog. Thaddeus rarely mentioned his late wife, and any attempt by Lily to inquire about her past was met with a silence that was more telling than any words. It was as if a significant part of Lily's own identity had been deliberately erased, leaving a void that she couldn't quite comprehend. As the first tendrils of suspicion began to coil in Dr. Vance's mind, a sense of unease settled over the Bell mansion. The predictable rhythm of Lily's life had been disrupted, and the carefully constructed facade of their isolated existence began to show hairline cracks. The psychological weight of their unusual relationship, the secrets buried within the house, and the unsettling illness of Reverend Bell all contributed to a growing sense of foreboding. Thank you for watching the first chapter of our story. If you're intrigued by the unfolding mystery and want to see what happens next to Lilly and Reverend Bell, please subscribe to our channel for the upcoming chapters. This is a work of fiction. Dr. Elias Vance found himself returning to the Bell mansion more frequently than Reverend Thaddeus's condition strictly necessitated. While the Reverend's health fluctuated, never truly improving, Dr. Vance's motivations had begun to extend beyond mere medical duty. He was increasingly troubled by the atmosphere within the house, the palpable tension between Lilly and her father, and the almost complete isolation in which they existed. Lilly, in their brief exchanges, often appeared withdrawn, her responses measured and carefully considered, as if every word was weighed for its potential consequences. Yet, in her eyes, Dr. Vance sometimes caught fleeting glimpses of a yearning, a silent plea that resonated with his growing unease. He would engage Lilly in polite conversation during his visits, inquiring about her well-being and her daily life. Her answers were always vague, painting a picture of monotonous routine and unwavering devotion to her father. However, Dr. Vance noticed the subtle hesitations, the downward cast of her eyes, and the almost imperceptible tremor in her voice that belied her composed facade. He began to suspect that her outward compliance masked a deeper, more complex reality. Reverend Bell, even in his weakened state, remained a formidable presence. His gaze was sharp and perceptive, and he seemed acutely aware of every interaction between his daughter and the doctor. He would often interrupt their conversations, steering the focus back to his ailment or to matters of scripture. There was a possessiveness in his demeanor, a subtle assertion of control that did not escape Dr. Vance's notice. The Reverend's illness, while seemingly physical, was accompanied by a strange irritability and a heightened sense of paranoia, further contributing to the unsettling atmosphere of the mansion. Dr. Vance attempted to engage Mrs. Gable in conversation, hoping to glean some insight into the family's history or the nature of Lily's mother's absence. However, the elderly housekeeper remained an enigma, her responses curt and unrevealing. Her silence seemed less like a lack of knowledge and more like a deliberate guarding of secrets, her loyalty to the Bell family an impenetrable wall. One afternoon, while attending to Reverend Bell, Dr. Vance noticed a small, intricately locked wooden box on a table in the study. He casually inquired about its contents, but Reverend Bell's reaction was immediate and intense. His face flushed with anger, and he sharply dismissed the question, stating it contained private family matters. This vehement reaction only heightened Dr. Vance's suspicion, planting a seed of curiosity about the secrets the box might hold. On another visit, Dr. Vance found Lilly tending to the neglected rose garden. For a moment, she seemed slightly more relaxed, her hands gently pruning the thorny stems. He seized the opportunity to speak to her privately, his tone carefully neutral. "Lilly," he began, "you seem very dedicated to your father." Her hands paused and she looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "He is my father, Dr. Vance. It is my duty." "Of course," he replied softly, "but you also deserve a life of your own, Lilly. Companionship, perhaps. Interests outside of the house. A flicker of something, sadness, longing, or perhaps even fear, crossed her face before she quickly masked it. "My father provides everything I need." Their conversation was brief, interrupted by the Reverend's call from inside the house. But for Dr. Vance, it was enough to confirm his growing concern for Lilly's well-being. He sensed a profound loneliness in her, a stifled spirit yearning for something more than the confines of the Bell mansion. As the days turned into weeks, Dr. Vance found himself increasingly drawn into the orbit of the Bell family's unsettling drama. He began to pay closer attention to the subtle cues, the unspoken glances, and the carefully worded sentences that characterized their interactions. The mystery of Lilly's mother, the nature of Reverend Bell's ailment, and the unspoken sorrow in Lilly's eyes became a puzzle he felt compelled to solve. He knew, with an unshakable certainty, that the Bell mansion held more than just a sick man and his dutiful daughter. It held a dark secret, and he was now inextricably linked to it. The storm clouds of war were gathering on the horizon, but for Dr. Vance, a more personal and immediate storm was brewing right in front of him, hidden behind the genteel facade of a respectable family. The psychological horror of their situation was beginning to take its toll on him as well, as he found himself lying awake at night trying to piece together the fragments of the Bell family's fractured narrative. He was no longer just a doctor. He was a witness to a tragedy in the making, and his conscience would not allow him to turn away. The very air of the house, heavy with the scent of old wood and dried roses, seemed to carry a history of sorrow and control, a suffocating atmosphere that Lilly had lived in for her entire life. Dr. Vance, the outsider, was now at a crossroads. He could simply treat the Reverend and leave, or he could try to save a young woman from a fate he was beginning to believe was worse than any physical ailment. Driven by an insatiable need for answers, Dr. Vance began to subtly investigate the Bell family's history in town. He started with the most logical source, the local registry and old newspaper archives. He spent his afternoons in the dusty, quiet corners of the town hall, poring over records that dated back decades. His inquiries were met with polite suspicion, as the Bell family had always maintained a degree of distance and an almost untouchable reputation in the community. Most townsfolk spoke of Reverend Thaddeus Bell with a mixture of reverence and fear, a man of God whose austere demeanor and private life were seen as signs of his piety. Dr. Vance found the records of Reverend Bell's marriage to a woman named Elara. The date was over 20 years prior, a fact that didn't align with Lilly's age. This small detail, a discrepancy of several years, was the first concrete piece of evidence that his suspicions were not unfounded. The death certificate for Elara Bell stated she had succumbed to a lingering illness, a vague and convenient diagnosis that could cover a multitude of causes. A small, almost imperceptible detail caught his eye. The name of the physician who signed the death certificate was not a local one, but a traveling doctor who had since moved on. This raised another question. Why had a traveling physician been called to attend to the Reverend's wife when the Bell family was more than capable of affording a local doctor? He then ventured to the local church, where he spoke to the aging sexton, a man named Silas, who had known the Bell family for generations. Silas was initially guarded, but Dr. Vance's gentle persistence and genuine concern for Lilly managed to loosen his tongue. Silas spoke of Elara Bell, a woman of ethereal beauty and a bright, vivacious spirit, a sharp contrast to the somberness of the Bell mansion. He recalled her as a woman who was full of life, a constant source of joy in the community, and her sudden withdrawal from society after her marriage to Reverend Bell had been a topic of hushed gossip. "He kept her locked away, you see," Silas whispered, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Said she was too delicate for the world, too pure. But some of us, we saw the light go out of her eyes. One day, she just wasn't there anymore. He said she was too sick to see visitors, and then he just told us she was gone. It was all so quiet, so sudden." Silas's words were a chilling confirmation of Dr. Vance's worst fears. The Reverend's control over his first wife seemed to mirror his current control over Lilly. The mystery of Ilara's death, coupled with the Reverend's calculated isolation of both women, painted a disturbing picture. Dr. Vance returned to the Bell mansion, his mind a whirlwind of information and dark possibilities. He now looked at Reverend Thaddeus not just as a patient, but as a man capable of profound psychological manipulation and control. The Reverend's illness, which had seemed so perplexing, began to take on a different context. Could it be a psychosomatic response to his own guilt, or a deliberate act of weakness to keep Lilly close, to make her feel indispensable? The very foundation of what he thought he knew about the family was crumbling. He found Lilly in the library, dusting old books with a methodical, almost robotic motion. The dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight that pierced the heavy curtains. He approached her, his voice a low, urgent murmur. "Lilly," he said, "I have been doing some research about your mother." Her hand froze, the feather duster poised in mid-air. She turned to him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something akin to a desperate hope. "Why?" she breathed. "Because I believe there is more to her story than you have been told," he said. He didn't mention Silas or the records, knowing that would likely terrify her into silence. "I believe the truth of her life might be important. For you." For a fleeting moment, a spark of defiance lit her eyes. "My father said she was a frail woman, prone to illness, that she died of a broken heart, missing the world she couldn't be a part of." Her words were a rehearsed recitation, a narrative she had been told and had come to accept. "Did you ever see a portrait of her? Did she leave you anything?" He pressed gently. Lilly shook her head. "No, my father said it was too painful for him to have reminders. He keeps them locked away." The word "locked" resonated deeply with Dr. Vance. It echoed the same word Reverend Bell had used for the box in his study. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, forming a picture of a man who systematically erased the memory of his past and controlled the future of his present. He knew now that the locked box, which the Reverend guarded so fiercely, likely held the key to the entire mystery, and perhaps to Lilly's salvation. The psychological battle between the Reverend and Dr. Vance had now moved from a subtle war of wills to a direct conflict, with Lilly's freedom and sanity hanging in the balance. The stage was set for a confrontation, not of strength, but of truth against deception, and Dr. Vance knew he had to be ready. The chilling atmosphere of the Bell mansion, once a mere backdrop, was now a prison, and he had found the first tool to pick its lock. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper and secrets, and the silence that had once defined the house now felt like the held breath before a scream. The Reverend's health took a sudden and dramatic turn for the worse. The bouts of weakness became more frequent and severe, and his paranoia intensified. He became almost a caricature of his former self, a man whose physical decline was a mirror for his unraveling mind. He would call for Lilly at all hours of the night, demanding her presence, her reassurance, her unwavering devotion. His fevered ramblings often strayed into a tortured confession of his past, but his words were a jumble of scripture and disjointed accusations, revealing a mind consumed by its own dark deeds. This escalation provided Dr. Vance with a grim opportunity. The Reverend's state was so precarious that he required constant care, and Lilly, exhausted and terrified, could not manage it alone. The presence of Dr. Vance in the house became less of an intrusion and more of a necessity. He used this time to observe Reverend Bell more closely, noting the moments when his guard was down, when the mask of piety slipped, revealing the monster underneath. One night, the Reverend suffered a particularly violent fever spike. He thrashed in his bed, muttering incoherently about her and the sin. Lilly was at his side, her face pale with fear, trying to soothe him. Dr. Vance administered a sedative, but before the Reverend succumbed to the drug, he grabbed Lilly's arm with surprising strength. "You belong to me," he croaked, his eyes wide with a manic terror. "Always have, always will." His grip was so tight that Lilly winced, and it was only with Dr. Vance's intervention that he released her. This horrifying moment was the final catalyst. Dr. Vance knew he could not wait any longer. Lilly was in immediate danger. He needed to find the truth, and he knew where to find it. After the Reverend finally fell into a fitful, sedated sleep, Dr. Vance motioned for Lilly to follow him. He led her to the study, the room where he had first seen the locked wooden box. He was surprised to find Mrs. Gable waiting there, her face a mask of sorrowful determination. She held a small antique key in her hand, her gaze fixed on the box. "He keeps the spare here," she said, her voice a dry rasp, the first words he had heard her speak at any length. She pointed to a hidden compartment in the mantel, a secret she had likely kept for decades. He said it was to remind himself of his great victory. But it was no victory. It was a damnation. Mrs. Gable's words, and the raw emotion behind them, were a revelation. She wasn't just a loyal servant, she was a witness, an accomplice by silence, and now it seemed an ally. She handed the key to Dr. Vance, her hand trembling. "It's time she knows," she said, her eyes meeting Lilly's with a profound sadness. With a sense of urgency, Dr. Vance took the key and inserted it into the lock. It turned with a satisfying click, a sound that seemed to break the heavy silence of the room. He lifted the lid, and the contents were laid bare. Inside, there was a stack of letters, a small, worn, leather-bound journal, and a portrait. The portrait was of a young woman with a vibrant, almost wild beauty, her eyes full of a defiant spark that was entirely absent in Lilly. This was Elara Bell. She was smiling in the portrait, a bright, unrestrained smile that seemed completely at odds with the solemn atmosphere of the mansion. Dr. Vance picked up the journal. He saw Elara's name on the first page, followed by a meticulous, spidery script. He turned to a random page and began to read aloud, his voice low but clear. July 12th, 1842. Thaddeus's love is a cage. He says my spirit is too flighty for a proper wife, and he has begun to tame me. He calls it saving my soul. I fear he is not saving it, but burying it. A gasp escaped Lilly's lips. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and dawning horror. The truth, in the form of her mother's own words, was beginning to spill out. The woman in the portrait was not a fragile invalid, but a vibrant soul whose life had been systematically extinguished. The letters told a similar story, addressed to a sister or a friend, begging for help, for escape. The final entries were a desperate plea for a way out, filled with fear and despair. The most damning document, however, was a second, smaller journal. It was written in the Reverend's own hand. His meticulous records documented a monstrous and cruel campaign of psychological manipulation, isolating Elara from her friends, cutting off all communication with her family, feeding her lies about the outside world, and systematically breaking her spirit. He detailed his triumphs in turning her into a compliant, submissive wife. The final entry was a chilling and matter-of-fact record of her death, which he attributed to her weak constitution, a lie that he had crafted to hide his own monstrous cruelty. He called it a necessary measure to prevent her from escaping his control. A cold dread washed over Dr. Vance. The full, horrific truth was beginning to form. Reverend Bell had not only driven his wife to her death, he had done so with a calculated, sadistic intent. And now, he was doing the same thing to his daughter. The realization was a gut punch, a chilling affirmation of the darkness he had long suspected. The man he was treating was not merely sick, he was a murderer, a psychological tyrant who had created a living ghost in his own home. The horror was not in a physical threat, but in the monstrous, suffocating weight of a truth that had been buried for years and which now threatened to destroy Lilly entirely. The final, terrifying detail, revealed in a last-page scrawl in the Reverend's journal, was a twisted, possessive ode to Ilara's purity, ending with a line that sent a shiver down Dr. Vance's spine. Her spirit is gone, but her face, it lives on in our little Lilly. She will be the perfect reflection of my perfect wife. The implication was clear and utterly chilling. If you're as horrified and captivated as we are by the dark secrets of the Bell family, please subscribe to our channel for the next chapter. This is a work of fiction. The truth, once unleashed from the confines of the locked box, was a terrifying and all-consuming force. Dr. Vance and Lilly stood in the dimly lit study, the Reverend's journal clutched in Dr. Vance's hand, its pages a testament to a monstrous cruelty that was beyond comprehension. The portrait of Ilara Bell, vibrant and full of life, now seemed like a cruel mockery. Lily's hand was pressed to her mouth, her eyes fixed on the journal, a silent scream of disbelief and horror written on her face. Her entire life, the carefully constructed narrative of her existence, was a lie. Her mother was not a frail, broken woman, but a prisoner whose spirit had been methodically crushed by the man who was her father. The realization was a devastating blow, shattering the foundation of her world. He did this, she whispered, her voice a thin, reedy sound, barely audible. To her. Dr. Vance nodded slowly, unable to find the words to soften the blow. And to you, Lilly. He has been doing the same thing to you. The full weight of his words settled upon her. The isolation, the constant surveillance, the emotional manipulation, the strange demands for her devotion. It was all a part of a calculated plan to mold her into a living replica of her dead mother. He had not just been a controlling father, he had been a psychological tyrant, a puppet master pulling the strings of her life to a horrifying end. She looked at the Reverend's journal, and for the first time she saw her father not as a figure of authority, but as a predator. Mrs. Gable stood silently in the corner, a grim observer to the unveiling of the truth she had carried for so long. Dr. Vance turned to her, 100 questions on his lips. Why didn't you say something? Why didn't you help her? The old woman's shoulders sagged with a lifetime of guilt and sorrow. I was a fool, she said, her voice shaking. He had a way of twisting the truth, of making you believe that his way was the only way. He told me he was saving her from her rebellious spirit. He used scripture to justify his cruelty. And I was too afraid to challenge him. He threatened me. He said he would ruin me, ruin my family. After she was gone, I promised myself I would protect the little one. I tried to warn you, Doctor, with my silence, with my eyes. I hoped you would see what I saw. Her confession added another layer of horror to the already gruesome story. Reverend Bell's web of deceit was not just confined to the family. It had ensnared those around him, using fear and manipulation to enforce his will. The man who was revered in the community was a monster in his own home, and he had meticulously buried his crimes. The psychological horror of the situation was now fully realized. There were no ghosts or demons, only a man's capacity for evil and the fragility of a mind broken by relentless control. The Reverend's illness, which Dr. Vance had initially seen as a physical ailment, was now a manifestation of his psychological torment, his guilt festering beneath the surface, threatening to break through. He had been so consumed by his perfect creation that his own mind had begun to decay. The fevered ramblings were not of a sick man, but of a man losing his grip on his carefully constructed reality. Dr. Vance knew they could not stay in the mansion. The danger was now palpable. The Reverend, even in his weakened state, was a ticking time bomb. If he woke and found them with the journal, he would not hesitate to silence them. They had to leave, and they had to expose him. But where would they go? Who would believe them? The Reverend's reputation was a formidable shield, and their story was the stuff of nightmares, almost impossible to prove without the physical evidence of the journals and letters. "We need to get this to the authorities," Dr. Vance said, his voice firm and decisive. "We need to get out of here. Now." Lilly, however, was paralyzed, her mind struggling to process the enormity of the betrayal. Her world had been a gilded cage, and now she saw it was a tomb built on a lie. The man she had been taught to love and revere was a monster. The memories of his forced affection, his demanding piety, his controlling nature, they now took on a grotesque new meaning. She was not his beloved daughter. She was a replacement, a living tribute to his cruelty. "Lilly, we have to go," Dr. Vance urged, taking her by the arm. She pulled away, her eyes wild with a terror he hadn't seen before. "Where would I go? What am I? He said I was his daughter. But my mother, she was a prisoner. Am I just a new one?" Her identity, forged in the fires of a lie, was crumbling into dust. Dr. Vance realized that the psychological damage was far deeper than he had anticipated. He had not just revealed a secret. He had detonated a bomb in her mind, leaving her to sift through the emotional wreckage. He had to be her anchor. He had to show her that she was more than just the Reverend's creation. She was Ilara's daughter too. "You are your own person, Lilly," he said, his voice soft but insistent. "You have a strength he could never extinguish. Your mother had it too. Look at her." He pointed to the portrait. "She fought. And you will too. We will get through this. Together." His words seemed to reach her, a lifeline thrown into the dark abyss of her despair. She looked from the journal to the portrait, and then at Dr. Vance, a spark of resolve flickering in her eyes. The tears that had welled in them finally fell, a release of a lifetime of bottled-up pain. The psychological torment was over, but the physical danger was just beginning. The Reverend could wake at any moment, and when he did, he would not be the broken man they had left. He would be a man whose carefully constructed kingdom was under siege, and he would fight to the death to keep his secrets buried. The silence in the study was punctuated only by Lily's soft sobs. The revelation of her mother's fate and the truth of her own existence had left her emotionally shattered. Dr. Vance, recognizing the depth of her trauma, did not rush her. He gave her a moment to grieve for the life she had been denied and the mother she had never known. Mrs. Gable, a silent sentinel, brought a glass of water and a blanket, her actions a quiet offering of support and empathy. Lilly eventually managed to compose herself, her face streaked with tears but her eyes no longer vacant. A new expression had taken hold, a quiet, simmering rage. The compliant, dutiful daughter was gone, replaced by a young woman whose spirit, though bent, had not been broken. "We have to get this to the sheriff," she said, her voice stronger now, a conviction in her tone that surprised even Dr. Vance. "He needs to pay for what he did, to her, and to me." "That's what I was thinking," Dr. Vance said, relief flooding him. "But we have to be careful. Your father has a formidable reputation in this town. We need to be able to prove everything." Lilly nodded, clutching the journals and letters. "This is the proof," she said, her grip tight. He can't deny his own words. Just as they were about to leave, they heard the telltale sound of the Reverend stirring upstairs. A floorboard creaked, followed by a low, guttural moan. The sedatives were beginning to wear off. They had to act quickly. "We'll go through the servants' entrance," Mrs. Gable said, her quiet competence a welcome anchor in the rising tide of panic. "It leads out to the back field. We can get to town on foot from there." With a shared sense of urgency, they moved through the labyrinthine halls of the mansion. The house, which had always felt like a sanctuary to Lilly, now seemed like a tomb. Every shadow, every creak of the floorboards, felt like a silent witness to the atrocities that had occurred within its walls. They reached the back door and slipped out into the cold night air, the moon a sliver of silver in a sky full of angry, swollen clouds. A storm was brewing, both literally and figuratively. As they made their way through the dense woods that surrounded the property, the sound of a distant cry reached their ears. "Lilly! Lilly, where are you?" The Reverend's voice, now a high-pitched, desperate wail, carried on the wind. The sound was not of a sick man calling for his daughter, but of a puppet master who had discovered his puppet had cut its strings. They walked for what felt like hours, their clothes snagging on thorns and branches, the forest floor slick with mud. The weight of the journals and letters seemed to grow heavier with every step, a burden of truth they could not abandon. As the first drops of rain began to fall, they saw the faint, welcoming lights of the town in the distance. They were so close. But then a new sound, closer this time, cut through the rustling of the leaves and the sound of the rain. The rapid footsteps of someone running behind them. They glanced back and saw a figure, a silhouette of a man with an unsteady gait pursuing them. It was the Reverend. He was no longer the weak, frail man they had left behind. The fever and the rage had given him a grotesque, unnatural strength. "You will not leave me," he shrieked, his voice distorted by a chilling mix of madness and fury. "You belong to me, both of you." The implication of his words was clear. He had seen Dr. Vance and Lilly together, and in his fevered mind, he had conflated Lily's escape with her mother's attempted flight. He saw the same defiance, the same betrayal. The facade was completely gone, leaving only the raw, ugly truth of his monstrous possessiveness. Dr. Vance urged Lilly to run faster. They were no match for his deranged strength. They burst from the tree line and onto the muddy, rain-slicked road that led into town. The lights of the sheriff's office were a beacon of hope in the darkness. As they neared the office, the Reverend, fueled by a final desperate burst of adrenaline, lunged forward. He tackled Dr. Vance, sending him sprawling into the mud. The journals and letters were thrown from his hands, scattering across the ground. The Reverend's face, a mask of pure, unadulterated madness, was inches from Dr. Vance's. "I will not be exposed," he snarled, raising a rock from the ground, his eyes gleaming with a murderous intent. "The truth will die with me." Lilly, who had been momentarily stunned, saw the horrifying scene unfold. In a moment of pure, unthinking instinct, she grabbed a thick tree branch and swung it with all her might, hitting her father on the side of the head. The blow was solid and clean. He fell to the ground, unconscious, the rock clattering uselessly in the mud. Lilly stood over him, breathing heavily, the branch still in her hands. The girl who had been so compliant, so terrified, had found a reserve of strength she never knew she had. The shadow of her mother's broken spirit was replaced by the fire of her own. They were now in the open, exposed, with the evidence of his crimes scattered around them in the mud and the rain. But they were alive, and for the first time in her life, Lilly was free. She looked at Dr. Vance, her eyes no longer filled with fear, but with a new, quiet determination. The silence of the night was broken only by the sound of the falling rain and their heavy breathing. The long-buried secrets of the Bell family were now out in the open, and there was no turning back. They had survived the night, but the fight had just begun. The town sheriff, a man named Henderson, with a thick mustache and an even thicker air of skepticism, was a hard nut to crack. He listened to Dr. Vance and Lily's frantic, rain-soaked account with a weary disbelief. The story of a beloved reverend, a respected man of God, being a psychological tyrant and a murderer of his own wife, was too outlandish for a small, God-fearing community to comprehend. Reverend Bell's reputation was a formidable shield, and their story was too wild, too unbelievable. Reverend Bell? Sheriff Henderson scoffed, leaning back in his chair. He's a man of the cloth, a pillar of this community. You're telling me he's a murderer? And you, miss, he said, turning a dubious eye on Lilly, you're saying your own father held you captive? This sounds like a fever dream. The Reverend, having been brought in unconscious by Dr. Vance and Lilly, was now in a cell, stirring fitfully. His physical weakness had returned, but his eyes, when they occasionally opened, were filled with a chilling, malevolent hatred. He was no longer the frail patient. He was a captured predator. Dr. Vance knew they needed more than just their word. He needed the physical evidence, the proof that was now soaked and mud-splattered. He and Lilly rushed back to the spot where the Reverend had attacked them, the rain still coming down in a cold, steady torrent. The scattered pages of the Reverend's journal and Ilara's letters were a grim mosaic on the muddy ground. They carefully, meticulously, gathered every single piece. The ink had run in some places, but the chilling words were still legible. They returned to the sheriff's office, dripping wet and exhausted, and laid the soaked documents on his desk. "Read them," Dr. Vance said, his voice raw with emotion. "Every word. It's all there." Sheriff Henderson, still skeptical, began to read. He started with the letters from Ilara, her desperate pleas for help, her description of her husband's kindness that felt more like a cage. His expression, which had been set in a look of disbelief, slowly began to change. His brow furrowed in a deep frown, and his jaw went slack. He then moved on to the Reverend's journal, the meticulous, chilling entries about breaking his wife's spirit. The sheriff's face went from disbelief to a horrified understanding. He finally looked up at Lilly, his eyes filled with a new, profound pity. The truth was now staring him in the face, in the Reverend's own hand. The sheriff, a man who believed in the law and in the community's moral fabric, was now faced with the horrifying realization that the man he had respected and revered was a monster. He read a final entry in the Reverend's hand, a chilling and matter-of-fact record of Ilara's death, which he attributed to her weak constitution. A lie that he had crafted to hide his own monstrous cruelty. He called it a necessary measure to prevent her from escaping his control. The dam of the town's respect and deference to the Reverend broke. Other townsfolk were now gathering outside the sheriff's office, drawn by the commotion and the sight of the town's beloved leader being held in a cell. As the word spread, hushed whispers of Ilara's sudden seclusion and death began to surface. People remembered her vivacious spirit, her bright smile, and the strange sudden way she disappeared from their lives. The pieces of the puzzle, which the Reverend had so carefully scattered, were now being put back together by the very people he had deceived. Lilly, standing next to Dr. Vance, watched as the man who was both her father and her captor was exposed for what he truly was. The emotional weight of the past was finally being lifted from her shoulders. She was no longer a ghost in her own home. She was a witness, a survivor, and her testimony was the final nail in the Reverend's coffin. The horrifying truth of her mother's death, the deliberate extinguishing of a beautiful life, was a crime that transcended the physical. It was a crime against the human spirit. Just then, Reverend Bell, now lucid and seeing the crowd outside, began to pound on the bars of his cell. His face was a contorted mask of rage and defeat. "Lilly," he screamed, his voice hoarse and broken. "You are mine. You are my creation. I made you perfect, just like her. You will not betray me." Lilly, for the first time in her life, did not flinch. She looked at him, not with fear, but with a cold, unyielding gaze. "You didn't make me, Father," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You tried to break me, but you failed." The Reverend's scream was cut short by a fit of violent coughing, and he collapsed to the floor of his cell, a broken, defeated man. He had lost his last bastion of control. His perfect creation had turned against him, and in that moment he was no longer a revered man of God, but a miserable, convicted murderer. Thank you for watching this chapter. We are now heading towards the conclusion of our story. If you want to see how this all ends, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. The dawn that followed was cold and grey, but for Lilly, it felt like the first true morning of her life. The storm had passed, both in the sky and in her soul. Reverend Bell, now fully conscious but a shadow of his former self, was moved to the county jail, awaiting trial. His reputation was in tatters, his carefully constructed legacy of piety and righteousness shattered by his own words and deeds. The town, once so reverent, now looked upon his mansion and his name with a new, chilling sense of horror. The whispers of Ilara Bell's fate had turned into loud, open declarations of outrage. Lilly remained with Dr. Vance, taking shelter at his small, modest home in town. It was a stark contrast to the sprawling, silent mansion she had always known. The house was filled with the clutter of a life lived freely. Books piled high on tables, medical instruments scattered on a desk, and a comfortable lived-in warmth that was a balm to her soul. She was safe, finally. The crushing weight of her father's control was gone, replaced by a profound sense of emptiness, a void where her identity should have been. Dr. Vance, ever the physician, recognized this new battle. The physical danger was over, but the psychological wounds were deep and would take time to heal. He gave her space to process her trauma, but he also made sure she was not alone. He spoke to her about her mother, Ilara, not as a victim, but as a person. He showed her the few letters that had been addressed to Ilara, written by her family, which spoke of her quick wit, her love for music, and her vibrant personality. He wanted Lilly to know the woman her mother truly was, a beautiful and spirited woman whose life had been cut short, but whose legacy of defiance had lived on in her daughter. Lilly began to come to terms with the horrifying truth. She saw her father's love not as affection but as a disease, a parasitic need to possess and control. His every action, every word, every rule he had imposed on her life now took on a grotesque, new meaning. The solitude he had enforced was not to protect her purity, but to ensure his absolute dominion. The forbidden bond of family was a perversion of a sacred relationship, a monstrous act of psychological incest that had left her an emotional orphan with a living, breathing ghost as her parent. The townsfolk, who had initially been so skeptical, now approached Lilly with a mix of pity and a burgeoning respect. They saw the quiet strength in her eyes, the same quiet strength that had allowed her to stand up to the man who was both her father and her jailer. Old Silas, the sexton, came to visit, bringing her a small basket of fresh-baked bread and a single white rose. "She loved these," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your mother, she loved them. You have her spirit, child. Don't you ever let it go." Lilly took the rose, its petals a stark white against the dark, muddy background of her memory. She had lived her entire life in the shadow of a lie, and now, for the first time, she was stepping into the light of the truth. She was not just Reverend Bell's daughter, she was Ilara Bell's daughter. And Ilara Bell was not a victim, she was a fighter. Mrs. Gable, who had silently slipped away after their escape, returned. She brought with her a small locket. "Your mother asked me to give this to you," she said, her voice filled with a profound sorrow. "She had it made for you, after you were born. She hid it, hoping to give it to you when you were older. But he found out. He took it from her. I stole it back from his lockbox after he had her put away. I've kept it all these years, hoping I'd have the chance to give it to you." Lilly opened the locket, her hands trembling. Inside, on one side, was a tiny, faded picture of Ilara, smiling broadly, a mischievous glint in her eyes. On the other side was a tiny braid of dark hair, tied with a thin red ribbon. It was her mother's, a physical, tangible piece of her mother's love that had survived her father's campaign of destruction. The small locket was a testament to the one thing her father could not extinguish, her mother's love for her. The long road to recovery had just begun. Lilly knew she would have to face the public trial of her father, the stares, the whispers, the questions. But for the first time in her life, she was not afraid. She had Dr. Vance at her side, a kind and unwavering ally who had saved her not just from a physical prison, but from a psychological one. She had the memory of her mother, a beautiful, vibrant woman who had fought until her last breath. She was no longer just a reflection. She was her own person, and in that, she found a strength that the Reverend's cruelty could never break. The shadow of the Bell mansion was receding, and for Lilly Bell, the sun was finally beginning to rise. The trial of Reverend Thaddeus Bell became a national sensation, a morbid fascination that overshadowed even the news of the war raging in the distance. The quiet, conservative town was thrust into the spotlight, its dark secrets laid bare for the world to see. Reporters from as far away as New York and Boston flocked to the county courthouse, their pens poised to record the sordid details of a man who, a mere few weeks ago, had been a pillar of the community. The Reverend, now a hollowed-out shell of his former self, sat slumped at the defendant's table, his once commanding presence replaced by a haunted, vacant stare. The truth of his crimes had consumed him, a psychological retribution that was more profound than any prison sentence. Dr. Vance was the first to testify, his medical expertise lending a grim credibility to his account. He spoke of the Reverend's peculiar illness, the strange possessive dynamic he had witnessed between father and daughter, and the chilling contents of the journals and letters. He was a beacon of calm, rational fact in a courtroom filled with sensationalism and shock. He presented the documents as irrefutable evidence, and the court clerks read aloud the most damning entries, their voices a monotone whisper of a monstrous cruelty. Then came Lilly. She was dressed in a simple dark dress, her face pale but her eyes unwavering. The courtroom, packed to the rafters, fell into a profound silence as she took the stand. She was no longer the fragile girl who had been confined to a gilded cage. She was a woman whose testimony would send a monster to his rightful place. She spoke of her childhood, the strange rules, the absolute isolation, the constant fear of disappointing her father. She described how he treated her both as his child and as his companion, a perversion that she had only now begun to fully comprehend. She spoke of the night of their escape, the Reverend's fevered pursuit, and the terror of his unmasked rage. She described the man she had believed to be her loving father as a psychological predator, a man who had not only killed her mother's body, but had tried to murder her spirit as well. Her testimony was not filled with histrionics or tears, but with a quiet, devastating honesty that cut through the silence of the court and resonated deeply with everyone present. She spoke of the locket Mrs. Gable had given her, a symbol of a mother's love that had survived a father's hatred. Lilly's testimony was the final nail in the coffin. The prosecution rested, and the jury, a group of local townsfolk who had known the Reverend for years, returned with a unanimous verdict of guilty on all counts: murder, false imprisonment, and psychological abuse. The sentence was swift and absolute: life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. The Reverend, upon hearing the verdict, simply slumped in his chair, a final hollow defeat in his eyes. The monster was finally caged. The trial's conclusion brought a sense of closure to the town. But for Lilly, it was only the end of the beginning. She was now free, but she was also a woman without a past, a history, or a family. She had been left in an emotional and psychological vacuum, and she had to learn to build a new life for herself from the ground up. Dr. Vance, true to his word, became her steadfast friend and ally. He helped her navigate the complex legal and social aftermath, from settling her father's estate to dealing with the unwanted fame that her story had brought. He helped her sell the mansion, the symbol of her imprisonment and her mother's death, and with the money, she decided to do something that had been forbidden to her entire life. She decided to get an education. She enrolled in a women's college in a neighboring state, a small, quiet institution that allowed her to learn and grow in a safe, nurturing environment. The transition was not easy. The world was new and overwhelming, filled with people who had lived lives she could only dream of. But she had a resilience born of her suffering, a quiet determination that surprised everyone who met her. She learned to read books not because she was told to, but because she wanted to. She learned about history, about science, about the world she had been so meticulously shielded from. Dr. Vance wrote to her regularly, his letters a source of comfort and a link to the life she was slowly leaving behind. He wrote about his own life, about his medical practice, and about the quiet town that was slowly recovering from the shock of the Reverend's crimes. He never pressured her to return, instead encouraging her to find her own path, her own way of being in the world. And in her letters, Lilly wrote about her progress, about the small, everyday victories that marked her journey. She wrote about the friends she was making, about her classes, and about the profound joy of living a life that was finally, truly, her own. She was no longer a victim, she was a survivor, a testament to the unyielding strength of the human spirit. The story of Lilly Bell, the woman who was both daughter and wife to the same man, was not a story of a broken woman, but a story of a woman who was finally truly free. Years passed. The memory of the Reverend Thaddeus Bell, the monster of the Bell Mansion, faded from a national scandal to a grim local legend. The mansion itself was torn down, the land sold and divided, erasing the physical footprint of Lilly's confinement. She had completed her education and had moved to a different city, a new name, a symbol of her new life. She was no longer Lilly Bell, but a woman who had found her own identity, forged in the crucible of her trauma, but defined by her own choices. She had become a teacher, a profession she had chosen with a deliberate and deeply personal purpose. She taught young children not just reading and writing, but empathy, compassion, and the importance of questioning authority. She wanted to instill in them the very things that her father had tried to extinguish in her. She taught them that their voices mattered, that their feelings were valid, and that they had a right to be themselves, to live their own lives, to make their own choices. She and Dr. Vance remained close, their bond forged in the crucible of their shared experience. He would occasionally travel to see her, a journey that was no longer an investigation into a mystery, but a reunion with a dear friend. He saw in her a profound transformation. The fragile, melancholic girl he had met years ago was gone, replaced by a woman of quiet strength, a warmth and a wisdom that was born of her suffering. They often spoke of the past, not with a morbid fascination, but with a sense of quiet reflection. They had saved her, yes, but she had also saved herself. She had found the strength to fight, to endure, to rebuild her life from the ashes of her past. She had not only broken the cycle of abuse and control, but she had also become a living testament to the power of resilience. One afternoon, sitting in a park under a bright, clear sky, Lilly turned to Dr. Vance. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened to me?" she asked, her voice soft. "I do," he said, his gaze fixed on a group of children playing on the grass. "I believe you would have found a way. You were never just a prisoner, Lilly. You were a survivor, even when you didn't know it." She smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached her eyes. "I think so too," she said. "My mother gave me a beautiful spirit. My father tried to snuff it out, but he couldn't, and I have you to thank for helping me find it again." He reached for her hand and squeezed it gently. "You found it yourself, Lilly. I was just there to point you in the right direction." The story of the woman who was both daughter and wife to the same man was a story of a lie, of a horrifying truth, and of a woman's journey to reclaim her life. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, and a chilling reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not born of magic or myth, but of the darkness that can exist within the human heart. Lilly Bell's story was one of terror, but it was also a story of hope, a beacon for anyone who had ever been trapped in a lie, a proof that no matter how deep the darkness, the light of truth and the power of the human spirit will always find a way to break through. She was no longer a victim, but a testament to the indomitable power of a woman who dared to stand up against a monster, and in doing so, found her true self. Thank you for watching the entire series. We hope you were captivated by this story and inspired by Lilly's journey. If you enjoyed this and want to see more real-life terror stories like this, please subscribe to our channel. This is a work of fiction,